So I'm about to get started on actually hanging my drywall. I finished installing all of the insulation, and I even went through and added shims where they're necessary. I plan on explaining some of the techniques that I tend to use for hanging drywall, as I find that my methods are different than what most professionals and contractors use, at least with mainstream YouTube videos that are available. In particular, I will try to explain why I hang my drywall vertical rather than horizontal. So for my basement project, I estimated that I need about 54 sheets of drywall, maybe 56, but I decided to start off a little light, and I can go back and get a couple of more sheets. Now, as it happens, drywall weighs approximately 1.6 pounds per square foot, at least half-inch drywall. So if you just kind of go through the math, that's, let's see, 4 times 8 times approximately 1.6 pounds, that's approximately 51.2 pounds per sheet. But then you got 2 sheets per bundle, because they recommend you actually carry, drywall, in the bundles so that they don't break on you. So you take your 51.2 pounds times 2, and then you come up with approximately 102.4 pounds. So 102 pounds is quite a bit. And that's really more than I wanted to impose upon my neighbors or friends to help me carry down into my basement. And I certainly didn't want to, solicit the help from my wife for the two of us to actually attempt to carry that much drywall down into our basement, because I want to have, some energy left to actually go through the process of installing my drywall. So if you have a reasonably large drywall project, more than just a few sheets, I would highly recommend that you have your drywall delivered and placed. So why do I prefer to hang my drywall vertically? Well, to demonstrate, I thought it would be worthwhile talking a little bit about hanging drywall horizontally. So I've placed a sheet of half-inch drywall, 4 by 8 foot, up against the wall here horizontally, just to explain. So why would you hang your drywall horizontally? I mean, clearly there's some advantages. Otherwise, professionals wouldn't be doing it. Well, the main reason is because they're trying to get work done fast. So you're going to gain speed by hanging your drywall horizontally for a couple of reasons. So one is that you can actually get drywall in quite longer lengths. You can go 12 foot for sure, and I believe you can go as long as 16 foot. So you can imagine, like in this space here, I forget exactly what the length is, but I may have been able to sheetrock this wall with just 2 sheets of drywall if I had help. And assuming that you could do this wall with just 2 sheets, you would have exactly one 16-foot joint right down the center. So you can imagine that the actual taping and finishing would go really fast as well. So that's the real reason why professionals and contractors, use the horizontal method. Okay, so why don't I like to use it? Okay, and why do I hang my drywall vertically? There's a couple of reasons. So, first of all, if you put your drywall horizontal like so, you're going to wind up with your tapered joints, the parts that fill with tape and mud real nice. You're going to have one in the center here, which is okay, but you're now going to have one down against the floor where you need to place your base molding. Well, I want to get my base molding nice and flat, and I don't want to have to go back and fill that to get it flat. I really want a nice square edge like you would get on a butt joint. So that's the first thing. So I'm kind of misusing the design of the drywall, in my opinion, by having that tape. I'm wasting a tapered joint essentially by putting it down at the floor. Consequently, if I have to place a second sheet above this one in order to take advantage of this joint, I'm going to have to lift a 4 by 8 foot sheet of drywall, or in the case of, longer sheets, 12 foot sheets or what have you, and I'm working alone. I'm just a do-it-yourselfer, you know, and I learn as I go. So I'd have to lift a 51, potentially a 51-pound sheet of drywall, which I could do, but I would prefer not to. I'd have to lift it up there and hold it and staple it and everything else. Whereas a vertical sheet, it'll be supported by the floor. All the sheets that I'm going to be hanging are supported by the floor. Now, obviously, all bets are off with the ceiling. You're going to have to support those sheets no matter what. But in my case, recall, I'm installing a suspended ceiling, so I won't actually be putting drywall up on the ceiling. Now, incidentally, if I was installing drywall on the ceiling, I would do that first. So once you get that sheet up there, so I have to lift that sheet up there, now I got this tapered joint, which is true, but this whole joint is unsupported. Now for me, that's I don't care for that. I went through a lot of trouble and expense, I may add, putting up all these studs and top plates and so on. So if I hang my sheetrock vertically, I'll be able to support all the edges on actual wood. So why would I give that up just for the sake of saving some joint compound and tape? So another benefit, or another reason that I prefer to go vertical, is if you're hanging your drywall horizontally here and you really want to take advantage of the speed, you must have your studs on exactly the right centers. I mean, if you're off by just a little bit here, by 3/4 of an inch or half an inch or what have you, then you're going to go through and you're going to have to trim the edge of your drywall. So if you're brand new to framing and drywall and everything else, this is your first time doing all this stuff, I submit that you'll give yourself a little bit more leeway by hanging your drywall vertically, as I'll get to in just a moment. So those are all my reasons, right? I don't want a taper joint at the bottom, okay? And there's one more reason too. I don't want an unsupported joint along the horizontal section here, right? I don't want to have to lift a sheet of drywall up if I don't have to. If I was finishing the ceiling, I certainly wouldn't want a tapered joint in the corner, okay? So, and then the other thing is that if you hang your sheets horizontal and they're not long enough to do the whole wall, you're going to have at least one butt joint. So by butt joint, I mean a joint that does not take advantage of the tapered edge of your sheetrock. And as a beginner, someone that's never done this before, if you're brand new to drywalling, getting a nice look on a butt joint, okay, is very difficult. Okay, so I'm going to hang my drywall vertically. So it's kind of the I get all those advantages like I described, and there's some disadvantages. So I'm gonna hang my drywall vertically. I'm gonna have to cut it to length because I don't have 8-foot ceilings here. So I'll cut it as tall as the wall minus about a ½ inch, and I'll put a spacer on the floor because recall I have a floating floor, and I don't anticipate it's going to move much if at all. So I'm gonna leave a ½ inch underneath. Then what I will actually do, okay, is I will cut the first panel smaller than a full sheet. Okay, so I will make the tapered edge will fall either on the first or the second stud, depending upon how I decide the layout works on this wall. And the reason I'm going to do that is, there's really two reasons, but the main reason is because I do in fact want a non-tapered edge in the corners, so I have really nice square corners. I want nice square corners, square edges in the corner, at the ceiling, especially if I have a finished ceiling, and I have a few because inside the closets and so on, and I want nice square edges down where the base molding goes, so when I put the base molding up, it lays flat. Also, now in this particular case, I have my centers framed properly, so this thing would fall on exactly 16-inch centers. But when you do the next wall, unless you really thought about it, okay, you're going to be off by half an inch on the next sheet because of the thickness of the drywall that's on this wall. So if that was to be the case, I can, if I need to, I can cut this panel at whatever width that I want. So then what I will do is I will move along with full width sheets all the way down the wall until I get to the last piece, and then I will cut that piece exactly the opposite of what I did here. And sometimes you actually get lucky where you can use the other half of the first sheet that you used, or as you go through your project, you will take part of a sheet from one sheet. Does that make sense? Yeah, part of a sheet from one panel, let's say it that way, to use elsewhere. So you may use 16-inch plus piece here, you may use another 16-inch plus piece somewhere else. I'm always trying to make good use of all the tapered finished edges. So in the interest of time, I went ahead and got started on hanging my drywall. As you can see here, I completed hanging the drywall on the east wall of the main space of my basement. The leftmost bay, as you see here, is less than a full sheet, approximately 2 bays. Then I got 2 full sheets, and then the final sheet on the right-hand side is a little over 2 bays wide. So in my opinion, one of the main advantages of hanging drywall vertically is that you can adjust your stud spacing to accommodate various features on the wall. Now, I don't mean the actual centers. I laid out my wall so that my studs are still on 16-inch centers, but I was able to shift the placement of the studs to accommodate some of these features. Now, in this particular wall, I have sort of 3 distinct features that I need to accommodate. The one right in the center of the wall is my water main, which I'm adding a access panel for the shutoff valve and for a drain. And I wanted that to wind up pretty much in the center of that access panel. The other feature is the 2 ingress-egress windows, which actually happen to be on approximately 128-inch centers. So I didn't want to have weird, really weird spacing for the studs on those windows. I was trying to make the studs sort of fall sort of naturally at the edges. So you can see here, I actually have the trimmer for the upper header is actually one of my placements on a 16-inch center, which one could argue is maybe not ideal, but it turns out trying to move things around one way or the other, I would just have these extra weird studs. And the third thing I was trying to accommodate was I really was trying to get as close to a 16-inch center on either end of the walls as I could, and I'll cover that in a little more detail here in a moment. So I had, of course, 2 ends. I have this eastern end here on the right-hand side of the north wall, and then if I pan over to the other end of my wall, I also have what's approximately a 16-inch bay on the west wall as well. So before I get started, I thought it'd be worth kind of going through some of the tools that I tend to use. So first of all, for cutting, for the most part, I use just a standard utility knife with a collection of blades. It's helpful to start off with a nice sharp blade, but as you'll find, they get gummed up with gypsum pretty quick. But I'll demonstrate that as I go. But it's just for slicing the paper and then scoring the gypsum for breaking it later on. For the smaller pieces, making notches and cutting out openings for outlets and so on, I tend to use a good old-fashioned drywall saw. Of course, you'll need a measurement device. So in my case, I got my trusty and well-used 25-foot power lock. something to mark, I just use a standard, carpenter's pencil that I keep reasonably well sharpened, so I can make marks and so on. A couple of straight edges. So years ago, the camera probably can't pick up this whole thing, but years ago, I just purchased a piece of aluminum flat stock at one of the big box stores. That's, in this case, it happens to be 1.5 inches wide and probably 3/16 of an inch thick. It wasn't sold as a straight edge per se, but it's reasonably straight, and I use it for all kinds of projects, mainly as a guide for a circular saw when slicing plywood and so on. This one happens to be 6 feet long, so it's not the length of a full sheet, but it works for what I need to do. Of course, I have a carpenter's square, which you can see is pretty well used, maybe because it serves kind of dual purposes. I use it for welding projects as well as woodworking, so it's got some wear and tear. I do wear gloves pretty regular, particularly when I'm cutting and lifting, moving drywall around. Not that it's dangerous per se, but boy, it really dries out your skin on your hands. So generally speaking, I try to protect my hands a little bit when I can. Now, as far as fasteners go, there are two types of basic fasteners, and I'm not using anything that's terribly sophisticated. So here we have a ring shank nail that obviously you drive with a hammer, and I don't use a ton of these, but oftentimes when you're first placing a sheet and it wants to fall away from the wall for you or whatever, sometimes just 1 or 2 nails strategically placed is all you need to hold that sheet in place. So I keep a number of nails in my tool belt. So the main fastener that I use, of course, is which ubiquitously referred to as a drywall screw. These happen to be number 6 coarse, and these are 1 5/8 inch long. I can't think of any reason not to go deep. You can also get 1 1/4 long drywall screws, which these are probably more tend to be used for 5/8 inch drywall. But this is the screws that I selected. Now for driving, one could use a cordless drill driver, but I don't actually own any cordless tools. Okay, I'm still pretty old school. Not that I have anything against cordless tools. I just don't happen to own any, and I don't do enough of this kind of work to keep batteries charged and in use. So this is my trusty Milwaukee 1/2 inch drive Magnum hole shooter, which I've actually owned for about 35 years, and it's really served me very, very well. I've literally driven thousands of screws and drilled thousands of holes and so on and so forth. So use what you have. If cordless tools is what you have, use them by all means. And if you got specialty drill drivers, then by all means do that as well. Years ago, when I did my very first drywall project, I actually purchased this tool, which is referred to as a dimpler. It's actually embossed right in there, which I actually liked real well, and I would still be using it, except it's been giving me some trouble. So one thing that's really nice about this tool is it's got a sleeve inside. You can see here that's actually magnetic on one side, and it actually kind of floats around inside of there. So if you're not going in exactly perpendicular to the drywall, it'll follow the contour of the screw a little bit. I mean, not by very much, but it will. So it's magnetic, so it'll hold the screw, and then the bit itself is replaceable. So you can see here it's sort of convex shape, so it can actually tilt around in there just a little tiny bit. And you can, as I mentioned, you can replace the bit, which I just did recently. But what's been happening recently, and I don't know what to make of this, is that the guts are not staying in the tool. So as I'm moving along, oftentimes the guts will pop out on me, and I got to stop what I'm doing and I got to shove it back in the tool. and it's just been slowing me down too much. So I'm not sure why that's happening, and I was not able to find another one easily. Maybe I can find one online and order one. So what I did is I purchased a pack of 4 of these drywall bits, which which aren't the same, but the idea is that it's got a collar, and here's one that's out of the package. It has a collar that will prevent you from driving the screw too deep. The difficulty with this is it's all rigid, and unless that screw is absolutely perpendicular to the drywall, or if you push in and actually forcibly dimple the paper, you may not set that screw all the way. So what I've been finding is after I get done screwing up a sheet or a wall, I have to go back with a standard bit and add a quarter or half a turn to some of the screws. So what happened is I would chuck a 2-inch Phillips head bit in my drill just to do that, and I found myself just continuing on, just using this 2-inch bit. Now you'll notice it's extended. It's on a 2-inch shaft, which actually helps getting into the corners. But with a little bit of practice, you can actually do a pretty respectable job of setting screws with just a standard number 2 Phillips bit. So, and I'll show that as we go along. Drywall actually comes in bundles of 2 sheets, where the good side is facing each other, and it's sort of taped together with this paper tape on the short edges. So the first thing we need to do is remove the tape and flip over the upper sheet so the good side is facing us so we can work with it. Okay, so to unbundle drywall, you're meant to be able to just grab this tab and pull. Now, what I'm experiencing with this particular brand of drywall is that's not working very well. So I've been taking my relatively sharp blade and utility knife and scoring it all the way down, and then holding it back, and then scoring it again. Maybe an extra unnecessary step, but I don't wind up with that paper fighting me as I go. Now once you have both sides cut, it's a relatively simple matter to flip. I just like to pull it toward myself, stand it on edge, walk around to the other side, and just kind of slide it back in on itself. And there's the good side. Next, I just need to measure the height of my wall. Alright, so to cut this sheet to length, all I do is take my trusty tape measure, run it down to the other edge, make a mark, close to the tapered edge. Do the same thing on the other side of the sheet. Then I take my straight edge and I just place it on the line that I just made, the 2 lines that I just made. Open up my utility knife, and at a pretty low angle with a relatively sharp blade, I kind of just gently score the paper just to get a start, so I don't accidentally move my straight edge too much. And then I can do a second pass. I use a little more pressure, and I can definitely feel that I'm starting to cut into the gypsum. So there's my line. So now what I do is I'll cut into the paper on the taper a little bit, and then I'll, using quite a bit more pressure and a slightly steeper angle, I'll cut all the way, well, not all the way through, I'll cut deeper into the gypsum. Now, in this step, you can get as carried away as you want, but the deeper you cut, the cleaner the cut will be. So then what I do is I just pull the drywall out so it overhangs my stack. And then just using two hands, you just give it a little break, and it'll flop down like this. Now you could actually get carried away and come behind and cut the back paper. But what I do is I'm just going to cut through the paper from the front side. But what I found is I'm better off starting at the back end and just cutting through the part that's tapered, at least by a couple inches. And then what I do is I actually hold the knife sort of backward. So I'm going to cut in kind of upside down, so it's more of a slicing motion than a tearing motion. And that becomes really noticeable as your blade gets dull. You can see here that I'm already getting some gypsum stacked up on the blade, so it's not as sharp as it would otherwise be. So sometimes I start off with a little sawing motion. I tilt the utility knife kind of the opposite direction, which is normal. Get it jammed in there pretty good, and then I just work my way down, and away you go. So for this first panel, I'm going to cut this thing to less than a full width. In fact, it'll be approximately one bay wide. Now you'll notice it's a little hard to see because the way I got my insulation stapled up. But I got my 3-stud corner, or my 4-stud corner, and then I actually had an extra stud for hanging shelves. But in order to get the width of this stud bay under 16 inches, I actually wound up adding an extra stud. So I got 16-inch centers just about on this stud from this stud, but it's actually slightly over 16 inches from my drywall. So I marked the centers of all of my studs on the floor to aid in this process. To go up the studs, you can actually feel the studs and actually just go through the process of determining where the centers are. So next I got to cut this panel to width, and it's very similar to cutting it to length. I'm just using my tape measure. I'll make my marks. The only difference is that I have to make 3 marks because my straight edge is not long enough to go the full length of my drywall. So I've made my marks, and now I just need to get my straight edge on those marks, so I can go ahead and get right up on the drywall. It'll support my weight no problem. Take a relatively sharp drywall knife, and I'm just going to hold my straight edge in place. And the first pass, like I said, relatively low angle. And all you're doing here is you're just sort of scoring the paper. I'll move my hand down, and I'll move my way down a little bit. I get down to just past that second mark, and while I got the straight edge still in place, I'll go ahead and score the paper again. This time getting all the way through to the gypsum. You can tell by the feel of the knife that you're getting down into the gypsum. Then at this point, what I do is I shift my straight edge down, and I'm also going to shift the drywall itself down so that when I come off the edge, the back edge, I don't accidentally cut the bottom sheet. In this case, you can put the knife in the groove and then just slide the straight edge up against it. Again, light pressure on the first pass. And then again, with slightly more pressure, cutting all the way through the paper into the gypsum. Now at this point, what I'd like to do is I get up on it again, and I'll do at least one good pass, just trying to get down a little bit deeper into the gypsum itself. Now, depending on what you're trying to cut around, it may be worth doing a number of more passes. Now for this long section, what I'll do is, again, I'll bring it off the edge like so, on both ends, kind of paying attention that I actually clear my stack. And a little bit of pressure, I'll let it break. Now in this case, notice that the lower edge is actually resting on the floor. So it's good to support the other edge for this next step. And for shorter pieces, what I do is I put some 2x4s under there and so on. And of course it depends upon your work surface. You know, if you actually have a proper table or whatever, you can do this as well. So I'm going to move it away from the drywall a little bit just to make sure I don't cut into the good stuff. And using the technique I showed earlier, I just get the knife in there, tilt the knife back kind of in the opposite direction, and I'm using the natural V of the brake to just guide the knife all the way down. And you can see here it's being supported by this other sheet. So I can peel it away, and if I want to clean up that edge a bit, and if you can see here it's got a little bit of a high spot, you know, now's a good time to just, you know, take your knife and just run it right down the edge, and so on. And there you go. Okay, so now it's time to hang this piece of drywall. Now one of the advantages of a floating wall is I do have this extra 1/2 inch. But even if you didn't, the way I would do this is I'd place the top in first and then swing the bottom in. I have a scrap piece of drywall on the floor just to support that edge. And you can see here it'll stand on its own. And if it didn't, I would go ahead and drive a nail in. Now before I go ahead and secure this piece of drywall, what I actually will do, because it's the very first sheet, so it's quite important, so I'll remove my gloves and I'll actually just kind of check. I'll fold, you know, kind of push back on the insulation a bit to make sure that I have at least 3/4 of an inch available. And actually I don't mind having just a little bit more for the first sheet, because the sheets are exactly 4 feet wide, and as you go down the wall, you know, it's hard to keep those sheets really snug up against each other. So better to err on the side of slightly off center for the very first sheet. That said, I also want to check to make sure that that first sheet is pretty plumb. So what I can do here is I'll go ahead and put a screw in, and I'll put it up fairly high in the wall, and I can look down at my marking and to know that I have a stud right there, and I don't have to drive it all the way home. I can just set it. Then what I can do is I can come down to the floor, set my level again, and now I can afford to maybe just pull that away from the wall just a tiny bit. Once I'm reasonably happy, I can set another screw. So I thought I would demonstrate a couple of the bits that I have. So first I'll show, you know, the dimpler. So one thing that's really nice about the dimpler tool is it's magnetic. So you can just throw a screw in there. But you can see is it allows for a little bit of movement, this angular movement. So what I'm doing in this case is I'm trying to drive the screws in, but at a slight angle. So, because of the taper, I'm kind of fighting it in both dimensions. So you can see here, the idea is it just breaks. It just breaks when it gets to the drywall, but the guts keep falling out. So I'm not really sure what used to keep it in there. I'm missing something, but I think the camera can pick that up. It actually does a very nice job of setting the screw precisely where it needs to go. Next, I have this drywall bit that came in a pack of 4. These happen to be made by Milwaukee. I guess the idea is once the Phillips bit itself gets wore out, you replace the whole thing. It's just a solid piece. There's no replaceable bit. It's not magnetic. that's just being held in there because of the fit of the screw. So again, I can place the screw where I want. I'm going to angle it in toward the center of the stud just a little bit. I push them in, just drive it home. And then the idea is, you can see that the screw itself shifted just because of the grain of the wood. So what's going to happen now is, actually that did okay. You can see I actually dimpled the paper a little bit. But I find is, as I go, not all the screws get set flush. So then I have to go back and sometimes add an extra turn. So finally, I just have a conventional, just a straight Phillips head bit. This happens to be made by Milwaukee as well, but I think it's a 2-inch, which is kind of handy for getting into, like I said, corners, so you can clear the chuck. So if you're getting into a wall, you can kind of come in at a bit of an angle. So this is perhaps a little more tedious. Again, I put the screw in. I'm driving it in at a slight angle, so I'm kind of shooting for the center of the stud. I don't have to go quite that close. Drive it home. You can see it wobbles around to begin with. It skipped it there. And then it's kind of pulling in. You can see it now. I'm being a little bit more careful just for the sake of demonstration. And if it's not in quite as much as it needs to be, in this case it is, you can either give it a little squirt, like so, or you grab a hold of the chuck and just give it a nice turn. So now I'm making this look like it's slow because I'm talking and doing this at the same time. And it's a good thing I'm not chewing gum also. But you get reasonably quick at it, and then of course you can pull the drill away just as it pulls in like it needs to. Now see there I purposely didn't go in all the way. You can see the shadow maybe. So you can just kind of give it a little bit of a squirt. You get a feel for your tools after a while. And there she goes. Now you notice I'm actually putting in my screws fairly tight, closely together. I've seen recommendations for around the edges about every 8 inches. And in the field, maybe every 16 inches. But I figure, why not tighten up the edges really good? And then in the field, in the unlikely event that I want to hang something on the drywall, I'll have plenty of support. So I'm going tighter than what I've seen online. So when I get down to, for example, at the bottom of a wall where I've already placed a screw, then I got to decide, do I just split the difference like so? Or do I cut it into thirds? So I can go either way. And actually, since I'm at the bottom of the wall, I know that I'm not going to have anything that I'm really supporting. So I'll just go ahead and put a screw there in the center. So my next sheet is actually a 4-foot sheet, which is actually going to bring me all the way out to this stud right here. It's going to incorporate most of the window and this outlet. So of course there's a couple of ways of cutting those openings. One is you just put the sheet right up there, you get it tacked in, and then you cut the window opening, and then you do the same thing with the outlet. So I'm going to actually use a hybrid approach in this case. Oftentimes I just cut the openings before I put a sheet up, but the problem is I'll only have like an 8-inch piece hanging over, and if I cut this opening in ahead of time, there's a real good chance I'll break that piece off just trying to stand that up. I prefer actually cutting stuff on a flat surface. It's just easier to work that way, in my opinion. But in this case, I think it'll just work out better. So I'll wind up using a drywall saw to cut the horizontal pieces. At least that's what I think I'll do. And then I will score and break this edge. So in order to do that, I'll make sure that I get this dimension so I can measure off the edge so I get the thing to break where I want it to. For the horizontal sections, I can just use the sill and the header as a guide. But for my outlet, I'm going to go ahead and cut that in advance. So what I need to do in my case is I need to measure from the top plate down rather than from the floor up. And the reason is because I can't trust my floor, for one thing. Plus, I'm going to be pulling the drywall up above, and I'm going to push it up against the ceiling. So while I have my paneling flat, or horizontal I should say, I'll go ahead and score the paper where the vertical line is on my window. It'll just be much easier than doing it once the sheet's up against the wall. And this should still have plenty of strength. So again, just very carefully and lightly, I'll do the first pass. And now I'll come back through and I'll just do a second pass just to cut through the paper and start getting into the gypsum just a little bit. Okay, so I have this panel secured. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and cut out the lower edge. I'm going to cut out most of the upper edge, but I'm going to keep a little piece so that I can score the vertical section, and then I'll go back finally and I'll cut the last piece. So just laying this drywall knife saw flat, yep, it ended up right there. Okay, so for this upper piece, I'm going to leave a little bit so that I don't break off this piece prematurely. So I'm going to start back about here. So I'll leave the taper basically. This is all kind of an experiment for me, by the way. Now, by the way, I really should be wearing a dust mask, but in the interest of recording this video, I'm doing this without. Okay, so I got this little piece here sort of supporting this sheet so it doesn't break. Now I could stick a shim or something on that lower piece. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to score through this vertical seam more. Remember, I did a couple of passes while it was laying flat. So now I have a score mark that I can follow with my utility knife. I'm going to use my saw, and I'm just going to back cut this earlier saw cut all the way to the edge. I'm supporting the sheet with my left hand. Okay, now that I have it, I'm just going to go ahead and swing it in. So in theory, it worked. It should have snapped. And the sheet's now being supported by my sill. So at this point, I may be able to get in there with my utility knife again. Since I got an opening, I got more of a gap. And so first I'll just run my knife down, kind of clean it out a bit. And I'll just do it over and over again. I can actually tell now I'm probably cutting through the backing paper already. Okay, I think I did. Let's just go through it again. I'll get the blade in as deep as I can. Just to, do as clean a cut as I can. Okay. So in theory, that sheet is ready to fall out of there. Like so. To cut an opening in drywall, I just use my drywall saw. I start about 1/4 inch from the short dimension, as the saw itself wants to migrate backward. I blow off the dust as I go, and I just cut to the other short line. And then I spin the drywall saw around and I cut back toward the first short line. I repeat the process for the other long dimension. To cut the short lines, I find that the saw is going to want to back itself right up to the previously cut line. So I only have to just kind of do the one cut. And finally, I repeat for the last cut, cutting over a trash can to keep the mess localized. I press the blade through the drywall gently, starting about 1/4 inch or so from the adjacent line. I cut all the way down to the far end. Then spin the saw around and cut back toward the beginning, just so I get a nice square cut. Then I repeat for the other long dimension. In this case, I'm actually cutting through the tapered edge. So recall the gypsum's pretty dense here because of the way they make the taper. So I'm being kind of careful, especially since I'm so close to the edge. I don't want to snap that piece of drywall out. Again, I flip the saw over and I cut to the beginning. And I repeat the process for one of the short dimensions. You can see the blade wanting to walk itself back toward the original cut edge. And sometimes that's enough to where you can do the cut in just one motion. But in this case, I had to go back and just back cut that just a little bit. And finally, the fourth edge. This time I can just do it in one cut, cutting over a trash can to minimize the mess. Due to the style of electrical boxes that I decided to use in my basement, because I wanted the extra depth to accommodate the wiring that I'm using, these particular boxes have a flange that gets nailed to the face of the studs. So due to the thickness of the flange and the roofing nails that I'm using to attach the boxes to the studs, I have a little bit of a protrusion where the outlet boxes are installed. So if I was to screw the drywall over that flange around the boxes, I run the risk of breaking out the drywall on these locations. And even if I don't, I'd wind up having a bit of a bulge there anyway. So what I decided to do is to cut a bit of a pocket on the back side of the drywall where the flange would lay. And for this I just cut around the periphery using a utility knife to a depth of about 1/8 of an inch. And then I score through the backing paper and the gypsum a number of times to just kind of break up some of that gypsum to, again, about a depth of about 1/8 of an inch. And then I follow up with the tip of my drywall saw and I just scrape out some of the high spots until I'm satisfied. To cut out an access panel, I prefer to secure the sheet to the wall first, and then using my drywall saw, I cut out the sheet in situ. In this case, I had marked the lines on the face of the sheet first, just as a guide, but then you can find the edge of your framing once you get going. And if you cut the hole a little bit small, you can always go back and trim up the opening to make it nice and neat. To cut through the drywall on the right hand side of my west window, I start by scoring the vertical line that I had previously drawn using a utility knife. I cut through the facing paper and get partway into the gypsum. Next, I follow up with my drywall saw to cut the lower horizontal line using the sill plate as a guide for my drywall saw. I get up on a ladder and I repeat for the upper cut, using the header as my guide for my saw. Then it's just a simple matter of folding the piece back on itself to break along that vertical line. Finally, I follow up with my utility knife again, clearing up the gypsum that's left in that break and cutting through the backing paper. Once I reach the bottom, I can just remove that piece. If you find this video useful at all, give me a like below. And subscribe to my channel to follow along with me as I complete the rest of my basement. And if you do, you get to see me in the next video.